It's really my pleasure this afternoon to introduce to you Michael Rynkiewich, who is as Roger said, the 20th lecturer in the series of the Louis J. Luzbetak SVD lectures on mission and culture. As you see in your brochure, Mike received both his master's and his PhD from the University of Minnesota, and his dissertation was on land rights in the Marshall Islands. He subsequently worked in Papua New Guinea, teaching at a wonderful place called the Melanesian Institute, which is an ecumenical institute which helps both local people from Papua New Guinea and also foreign workers and foreign missionaries to understand mission and culture. After Papua New Guinea, Mike taught for 8 years at Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky, in their school of mission and evangelism. Mike has published regularly throughout his career, publishing his first book in 1974, when I think he was like 15 years old, and publishing recently, and I think really significantly, his book called Soul, Self, and Society, which is an introduction, a fine introduction to missionary anthropology. Interestingly enough, one of Mike's 5 children, his daughter, is completing her PhD in anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. I've thought for a long time that Mike would make a marvelous Luzbetak lecturer. He is a first-rate anthropologist, as you will see. He is a seasoned missionary, and importantly, he is passionate about both. So this afternoon, as you see, Mike will speak to us on research, practice, and training, the challenge of mission in an increasingly mobile and complex world. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, our lecturer, Mike Rynkiewich.
Thank you very much. Thank you both, Steve and Roger. I count it an honor to be here in this position and to be invited to give this talk to you. So it's a privilege for me. And Steve, you know how old I was because you and I are the same age. Roger said that I had 45 to 50 minutes, but he didn't tell me that there would not be a clock in the room. So I am now setting my not alarm clock, but what do you call it? Stopwatch. Timer, and there it goes. Early Sunday morning, about 20 years ago, I started out on a 2-hour hike. I left the Melanesian Institute in Goroka, which is in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. It's about a mile high, as a matter of fact, in order to go up the mountain to a village there. The church I attended, Goroka United Church, had 2 small churches out in villages that were really on the periphery. And occasionally I would go up and preach in those churches. I walked up the mountain to Kaveve. The people usually do not know whether anybody is coming or not. And so they're not in church when you get there. It's a 2.5-hour walk. You might have been delayed, and they don't know who it is. So when you get there, then people start to arrive. And the church, the building is not very big, maybe from here to that wall and out to the table. So I stood outside as word went around the village and people started to arrive. And I stood at the fence to keep pigs out. I stood at the gate and shook hands with people as they walked in. And a little old lady shook my hand and held on to my hand, and then she said something in Alicano, Well, there are 835 languages, believe it or not, in Papua New Guinea. I learned 830 of them, but I did not learn. I did not know Alicano. But the woman beside her knew Alicano and Pidgin English. And so the woman said something, and the other woman translated, you mean like I'm hand blowing you too much. She really likes your hand. And I thought, yeah, she still has a hold of my hand, and she's still shaking it. And then she said something else in Alicano, and the other woman said, you mean like cut them all together, finger belong you. She would like to cut your fingers off. Now, I smiled back at the face that was smiling at me, and I held up this finger and I said, I'm all right, one pillow does all. It would be all right, but just one. And she laughed. So what happened? A competent missionary has to know language and culture. Everybody knows that, in theory. Father Luzbetak himself spent some time as a missionary in Papua New Guinea, and he reminds us that when missionaries turn to anthropology, they, quote, show how such an organized body of knowledge might be employed for a better understanding and realization of that mission. But what about my fingers? Well, as an anthropologist, I already knew that the people in that area used to follow a custom of actually cutting off the fingers of a beloved person who had died. Then they would take those fingers, dry them next to a fire, put them out in the sun, let them dry. Then they would drill a hole in the fingers, run a string through it, and wear it as a necklace around their neck. So I knew that what the old woman was saying was an affectionate expression. Something like, I like you so much that I would like to have you near me always. What's that have to do with mission? As I approached the Eucharist, I retold the story of the old woman wanting to cut off my fingers, and they all laughed, some of them nervously. I knew they didn't do that anymore. Then I read the Last Supper account in Luke, and I tried to explain the text. Jesus says in Luke, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. I noted that in Greek, the word desire and the adjective or adverb eagerly both have the same root. And so it could be translated, with great desire, I have desired to have this meal with you. And as I had told the woman's story, I said, that same desire is universal. Everyone would like to have the people that they love next to them always. This woman had it, and Jesus had it. And best of all, Jesus has promised to be with us always here in the wine and the bread, so the table is open. Come to the table. Father Luzbetak, as well as another founding father of mission studies, Eugene Nida, would have agreed, I think, with this use of anthropology to interpret the gospel in local terms. The process is called inculturation or contextualization. But you already know that. This is old news. Do you like that story? The story that I told and the way I told it fits into the genre of classic missionary stories, where a distant people have a strange practice that the missionary anthropologist figures out and then uses to teach the message. Those stories play well when we're back home encouraging congregations to support our mission. In these stories, the people are quaint or in need, and the missionary is the hero. Perhaps that's why I have never told this story in public before, or in print until now. It's a true story, and it's a good story, except that we are not living in the 1960s anymore. From a post-colonial perspective, the story smacks too much of the difference between us and them, and tends toward a white savior complex evident in many older missionary texts. As we gaze in the mirror, we see that there is something else problematic about this story. It is easily identified as a story from the past, a distant past set in an isolated village, and thus a story that's out of step with our fast-moving, widespread globalization, migration, diaspora, transnationalism, and hybridity of today's world. That story, although it happened in 1999, and that's what I looked like in 1999, is in many ways a relic of the past. And so am I. But still, here is the question that I want to pursue with you. How shall we prepare missionaries to work in the interstices of language and culture in this post-colonial, globalizing century? With stories like that? No, helpful as they are and interesting as they are, I don't think so. How shall we train missionaries, not just to navigate through nebulous networks, but to minister with quirky groups that pop in and out of existence as if they were elusive quarks hiding in a quantum field? Beyond training missionaries in Western apologetics, how shall we train missionaries to walk with individuals who display multiple identities and speak multiple languages, far outpacing our meager efforts, and all in the course of a single day? Finally, and perhaps most importantly, how shall we train missionaries to enlarge their vision, to shift their gaze to the historical and geographical contexts of the sick and the poor who need both health and opportunity? Father Luzbetak thought that missiology fit best within the subdiscipline called applied anthropology. In his terms, applied anthropology can be said to utilize anthropological knowledge and skill for practical human needs. It does this in much the same way the science of medicine utilizes for the purpose of health and illness, and knowledge and skill of physiologists, biologists, chemists, geneticists, and other sciences. His allusion to medicine is appropriate, since medical anthropology is the largest area of applied anthropology, so large it actually has its own niche between applied and academic anthropology, not unlike missionary anthropology. So following Father Luzbetak's method and his admonition that missiology must continually update itself, I want to trace the history of medical anthropology briefly as a model for understanding where we are in missiology. Medical anthropology is a hybrid discipline, and it emerged in the 1950s and 1960s. The assumption of the times was this: the West has the expertise and the technology to help underdeveloped countries, but it needs anthropology to breach the barriers of language and culture. In a word, we have the answer. Culture is the problem, in the sense that translation and teaching and language are required to get the message across. In the 1950s and 60s, it was an era, as you know, of Western optimism that came after World War II. The framework began even before the war ended at the Bretton Woods Conference held in 1944 in New Hampshire, where 44 nations led by the United States hammered out a vision of the way that Europe and Japan would be reconstructed when the war ended. This led to the establishment of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations with all of its subdivisions, including the World Health Organization. So you get the picture. We will help the world because we know what the world needs and how the world ought to be organized. We in the West have the advantages of superior science, economics, and politics. Medical anthropologists would be useful because they're able to decipher and interpret particular languages, discover where the obstacles to change lurk, and then provide a pathway to change. And in the rapid decolonization of Asia and Africa in the 60s and on into the 70s, and in the context of the Cold War, the project called development emerged. I have development in quotes because I don't believe in development or the programs that we've had. This was a context that was ripe for a particular type of applied anthropology. Anthropologists could be the experts who would guide development through the stumbling blocks and the pitfalls of culture and language. What questions did medical anthropology ask? Well, the UN set the goals with the Statement on Human Rights and through agencies such as WHO. Willing medical anthropologists were enlisted to pave the way for such improvements as clean water, sanitation, eradication of communicable diseases such as typhoid, measles, smallpox, and malaria. And in fact, anthropologists were supported by the UN and the US government to help accomplish these goals to increase the chances of program success in improving public health. The problem then was how to implement superior medical knowledge and practices in other countries in the face of cultural and linguistic obstacles. Medical anthropologists would advise doctors and scientists about how best to spread the biomedical program. So in that era, the 60s and the 70s, culture is the problem, Western medicine is the solution, and anthropologists will overcome the obstacles of language and culture. In the next era, in the 70s and the 80s, we saw the Cold War heat up, with small wars serving as proxies for the great powers. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank emerged as major players in global economics, particularly in terms of national loans, subsequent indebtedness, and then structural adjustment programs designed to trap countries in dependency. While the West pushed on with optimism, this was also the time when the new nations discovered that they had jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. The nations had apparently been liberated from colonialism, were now ready to follow the Western model of economic development, but they found that political independence was a charade because they were still economically dependent on their former masters. The continuing context of the Cold War twisted development into a struggle to entice and, if necessary, force developing nations to line up on the side of Western capitalism or Eastern communism. Those nations that resisted both sides became known as the Third World. By the 1980s, it was becoming clear that, while there were a few successes, many development projects were failures, especially the Green Revolution. Oh, if you remember that, and Norman Borlaug. Questions arose. Why has anthropology not been able to pave the way for the success of development, particularly the spread of biomedical expertise of the West? With clearly superior knowledge and practices available, it seems that people still resist adoption. In this new era, the 70s and the 80s, anthropologists and others began to assume that the people are the problem. Anthropologists concluded that the problem may be more complex, sophisticated, and deep-seated than they imagined. So they began to look for other influences that might affect people's decisions. For example, some anthropologists began seeing people as victims of progress. This is actually the title of a book by John Bodley, originally published in 1975, and now in its 6th edition. From another angle, anthropologist Oscar Lewis invented the culture of poverty idea as a way of explaining why the war on poverty programs were not working. This was the era of the overdetermination of culture as a cause, the reification of culture as an agent controlling the people. In this new era, what were the central questions in medical anthropology? Well, here's a statement that the Society for Medical Anthropology made in 1981. What are the dynamics of maintenance and change common to all curing systems? How are people recruited as practitioners and patients in curing systems? And how are the roles learned, carried out, and changed? What is the relationship between the health beliefs and health behavior? How does the curing system relate to other systems in a culture? What is the relationship between the pattern of life and the pattern of disease? As you can tell, this statement itself remains a standard structural functional approach, more nuanced than the earlier approaches, but still convinced that culture is uniform, unified, and that the adoption of Western medicine is the goal, and that the root of the problem lies deeper within the culture. Throughout the 1980s, medical anthropology picked up the nuances and new departures in ethnography, including the etic-emic distinction and the interpretive program of Clifford Geertz. Yet there was still, quote, the tacit assumption that medical systems are more or less homogeneous, unchanging, and single. Why did the people fail to adopt Western medicine? Well, failure was due to the backwardness or the waywardness of the people in underdeveloped countries. They were backward because their traditional culture had been eroded by colonialism, and now they were stuck in a self-perpetuating poverty, or they were wayward if they had adopted any revolutionary or Marxist ideas that made them resistant to capitalist development efforts. The concept of underdevelopment arose as a subtle way to accuse the people of failing to develop. The solution was that medical anthropologists needed to intensify their studies of the people who were resistant. That is, people are the problem. So anthropologists need to find ways to overcome that resistance. Finally, by the 1990s, thanks in part to the postmodern turn that occurred in academia in general, certainly occurred in anthropology, may have come from anthropology, and also in history and theology, scholars shifted their gaze from culture as the problem and from people as the problem to just the possibility that the global political and economic system was the problem. That is, not the culture, not the people, but we are the problem. This led to the emergence of what was called a critical biocultural approach in medical anthropology. The critical biocultural approach first expanded the context. The research gaze was lifted beyond the local context and culture to include governments, businesses, and other institutionalized forms of knowledge and technology in order to understand the problem of disease. In this era of global flows, as Leatherman and Goodman say, we must work to understand how nations, communities, populations, and even viral pathways are inextricably interconnected at regional, national, and global levels. Thus, things like Ebola, the Zika virus, SARS, and HIV/AIDS are all global threats as they cannot be understood or even confined to their own local contexts. Second, the critical biocultural approach directs anthropologists to interrogate inequality. No research project should proceed without asking how, quote, power relations structure inequalities in society. That is, the current poor health of some human populations must include the historical and global context of economic exploitation and political domination, must include the historical and global context, I said that. Unequal access to health care is not just an unfortunate accident, it is caused by forces at work in the global context. Critical implies an explicit recognition that health disparities emerge from social inequalities, and that efforts to specify the source and nature of those inequalities is a critical task of medical anthropology. Third, critical biocultural approach directs the researcher to always question knowledge. The anthropologist must shift her gaze 180 degrees to see that Western medicine itself is a cultural and social system with links to larger economic and political structures. All of this must be questioned from a new perspective, beginning with an admission that Western medicine is only one of many systems that deal with health and sickness. And you can't live in America and not know this. Fourth, the critical biocultural approach directs the medical anthropologist to tease out both structure and agency. The anthropologist must keep a balance between individual choice among limited options, that is agency, and the system that limits those options, that is structure. The anthropologist must foreground the choices that people really have and how people exercise compliance or resistance or reinvention. Finally, the critical biocultural approach to medical anthropology. In that approach, the anthropologist seeks different perspectives because culture is not uniform. Culture is not uniform. Culture is contingent, that is, dependent on the materials at hand, concepts, philosophies, and so on. Culture is constructed from these materials. That's an ongoing project in life. And culture is contested because different people in the same society have different perspectives on what has happened and what should happen next. Not all experiences are the same. That's a reading of the history of medical anthropology. And in this reading, medical anthropology began in an era where the assumption was that culture was the problem. Limited success with development programs shifted the gaze of anthropologists until they assumed that the people were the problem. Then ontological and epistemological turns forced anthropologists to switch the capture mode and take a selfie in order to mull over the possibility that we are the problem. Let me tell you now the story of one medical anthropologist, a man named Paul Farmer, who has based his work on the third premise that we are the problem, as an example of where that might take us. Paul Farmer has a PhD in anthropology from Harvard University as well as an MD from Harvard Medical School. He is currently both a professor of medicine and of medical anthropology at Harvard Med. Well, that's his day job, or his half-year job. His geographical area is Haiti, and his specialty is infectious diseases. He initially worked in a hospital where even the Haitian medical personnel tended to say that the people are the problem. They thought that the people were incapable of compliance with medical regimens and instructions about cleanliness because they tended to attribute the rampant tuberculosis epidemic to voodoo. Instead of depending on what he had been taught, Farmer undertook his own study to discover whether or not what the patient thought was even relevant to treatment. That is, to see whether the culture or resistant people were the problem, or maybe something else. From the patients himself, Farmer learned that to give medicines without food was tantamount to lave men sia ate, that is, washing one's hands and then wiping them dry in the dirt. So he constructed an experiment. He formed two groups. To one group, he gave medicines and instructions. To the other group, he gave medicines, instructions, nutritional supplements, regular visits by medical workers, usually him, and an honorarium for travel expenses, usually on a donkey. By June 1991, 46 of the 50 patients who had received the enhanced package were free of all symptoms. But in the second group, the cure rate was barely half of the first group, based on clinical, laboratory, and radiographic evaluation. I want to make sure you understand this. The control group was given only medicine and instructions, verbal instructions, while the other group was given the medicine, instructions, daily nutrition, periodic visits, and travel expenses. And the second group was healed, and the first group was not. Farmer was unwilling to consider disease in the singular or in the local, and by that I mean it was evident that, for example, the cholera outbreak that came after an earthquake in Haiti was just waiting to happen because of the vulnerability of the infrastructure in this land of poverty, and because cholera did not operate alone. In medical anthropology, Farmer is one of the founders of the notion of syndemics. That is, epidemics are not singular, but rather feed off of one another. So this is from two words, synergy and epidemic. Thus, the problem in Haiti was not the cholera epidemic, it was the synergism between cholera and tuberculosis in a context of extreme poverty. Treating one without the others was not going to accomplish the healing of the people, which is medicine's aim. Nor, by the way, will treating the mind without treating the body accomplish making people whole, which is mission's aim. Expanding the context, Farmer refused as well to separate the situation in Haiti from the history of geopolitics in the Western Hemisphere, nor from the present economic and political trap in which the rich have caught the poor. This is another strand of the twisted rope of syndemics. Farmer says, quote, in examining tuberculosis in Haiti, for example, our analysis must be historically deep, not merely deep enough to recall an event, such as that which deprived most of my patients of their land. It was a development project, but deep enough to remember that modern-day Haitians are descendants of people enslaved in order to provide our ancestors with cheap sugar, coffee, and cotton. Our analysis must be geographically broad. In this increasingly interconnected world, we must understand that what happens to poor people is never divorced from the actions of the powerful. Farmer has introduced another term into medical anthropology literature, structural violence. That may sound familiar, particularly to a Methodist like me. John Wesley used to talk about complicated wickedness, by which he meant about the same thing. And some of us know the term systemic evil, but of course, the evil in the system is there because someone rich and powerful, inserted the evil into the system to benefit themselves at the expense of the poor. Farmer saw, quote, a world designed by the elites of all nations to serve their own ends, the pieces of the design enshrined in ideology, which erased the histories of how things came to be as they were. Sounding like a missionary, Farmer claims that when children living in poverty die of measles, gastroenteritis, enteritis, and malnutrition, and yet no party is judged guilty of a human rights violation, liberation theology finds fault with the entire notion of human rights as defined within liberal democracies. We look at the lives of the poor and we are sure, just as they are, that something is terribly wrong. They are the targets of structural violence. As Farmer worked in Haiti, he also had a religious awakening. He noted that, quote, the fact that any sort of religious faith was so disdained at Harvard and so important to the poor, not just in Haiti but elsewhere too, made me even more convinced that faith must be something good. Drawing on his Catholic upbringing, Farmer began to work in medical anthropology, network in medical anthropology and in the church. In 1987, he formed Partners in Health, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting infectious diseases by working local and thinking global. His work in Haiti led people to where, quote, they were no longer merely asking if infant diarrhea was caused by germs, but they were asking whether the germs were caused by dirty water. And didn't dirty water come from the neglect of a feckless, greedy government? And wasn't that's the end of the quote I'm adding, wasn't that greedy government, the baby doc regime followed by a mere military junta, controlled by the State Department of the United States? Farmer saw the cause of social suffering as not nature, not individual choice, but rather social structures, economics, and politics supported by a religious ideology that justifies the inequality. Farmer's perspective and style of research and practice has brought him into alignment with Gustavo Gutierrez, so much so that Orbis Books published a volume of articles by the two in conversation with each other. When HIV, I thought I turned that off. Oh, did the opposite. When HIV/AIDS came on the scene, Farmer was quick to refute the dominant narrative that the disease came from Haiti. I don't know if you remember, but when it was first coming on the scene, that was the claim. His PhD dissertation in anthropology is titled AIDS, an Accusation. He demonstrated that Haiti could not be used as the scapegoat since AIDS had almost certainly come to Haiti from North America, carried by Canadian and American sex tourists who make Haiti a port of call because people in poverty can be expected to sell sex cheap. Once again, a case of structural violence and complicated wickedness. The rise of MDR, multiple drug resistance, in the treatment of tuberculosis led Farmer to oppose the standard treatment prescribed by the World Health Organization by demonstrating the danger of a one drug after the other approach. Instead, he instantiated a treatment regime involving a concoction of second-line drugs in tandem with a package of residential and nutritional improvements, all of which was monitored closely over time. Too expensive, said the World Health Organization, but Farmer asked how expensive it would be if multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis reached the rich. Resources are limited, said the World Health Organization, and Farmer agreed, but then asked, how did it happen that resources are limited in this particular place at this particular time? Farmer's work required changing the medical model from preventing the spread of disease to treating the patient in front of the doctor. Farmer's plan was based on spending enough time with people, treating all their needs, and still being there to be accountable for the results. In the end, Farmer recognizes that he benefits from white privilege. Most people end the discussion there. White privilege, oh, that's a bad thing, we ought to get rid of it. Instead, Farmer deploys his white privilege to benefit the poor. I can travel freely throughout the world and I can start projects and I can raise money, he says, implying I can put my white privilege to use in the service of the poor. Without much elaboration, that's Farmer's story. Without much elaboration, I think that we can see ourselves in the mirror of medical anthropology. Did we go through a similar stage in the 50s and 60s? Yes, missiology also went through an era where we thought culture was the problem. It was a necessary stage, Since prior to Eugene Nida and Luzbetak and Alan Tippett and others, little attention had been paid by missionaries to what anthropology could teach us about how to understand culture and language in order to communicate the gospel. This was the heyday of the post-World War II missions, when new mission fields were opened up. Advances in descriptive linguistics helped grow the SIL Wycliffe Bible Translation Project. And in that context, missiologists, particularly Christian anthropologists and linguists, accomplished that mission. That stage is now past. As I said at the beginning, everyone should know that we need to take time to learn language and culture. Did missiology go through the second stage that I identified? Yes, we moved on to an era in the 70s and 80s where, like medical anthropology, we concluded that the people are the problem. Popular missiology gave us the concept of resistance to our vocabulary. Not only was it necessary to learn language and culture, it seemed that despite our best efforts, people were stubborn, resistant, even militant in opposition to the gospel. All of these words contribute to scapegoating the people as the problem. The 1970s and 80s saw the rise of metrics in missiology with the identification of certain people or regions or religions as resistant for one reason or another. Louise Bush named the home of most Muslims and Hindus in the world as the resistant belt in the 1989 Lausanne II conference in Manila. There followed the declaration of the 1040 window, which was adopted by the Joshua Project with maps that include things like the poor and the lost. Think about that for a minute. Perhaps they've never read the Gospel of Luke, according to Luke. Jesus came to help the poor, but it is the rich who are lost. There are many theories about why some people or cultures seem to be more resistant to the gospel than others, but it always comes to the conclusion that the people are the problem. And the missionary has to find a way to get to the individuals and separate them from their culture. Usually the mental gymnastics involves equating to other people's culture with the world, avoiding, of course, identifying the missionary's own culture with the world. Have we gone through the critical third phase that I have identified for medical anthropology? No. We are in it, but not through it. For example, in this third era, Don Richardson has claimed that Islam is resistant because Islam has no redemptive analogies. We are aware of the importance of critique and reflexivity, but we have not yet completed our passage through this stage. It is time for missiologists to ask, if certain people or cultures seem resistant to the gospel, why is that? Is it something internal or inherent in the culture or in the people, or is it due to something in the bad experience that people have had with missionaries and others from so-called Christian nations? Have we adopted a critical posture, or instead are we still defensive about our colonial ties? Have we thoroughly examined our assumptions about power, about perspective, about reality, about voice, and about representation? Have we considered what it means to be Christian in a particular culture? Or are we perhaps in danger of hearing the Master say, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? How can you say to your neighbor, 'Friend, let me take the speck out of your eye,' when you yourself do not see the log in your own eye?" So how shall we prepare missionaries? The teaching of anthropology in seminaries and missionary training programs is widespread but thin in many places. Students do arrive or do not arrive with social science research training, nor do they arrive with the critical skills necessary in today's academic world. Traditionally, the posture of the teacher of mission has been to emphasize content. That is, to prepare people for mission in villages or cities, prepare them to do mission in the now decrepit categories of band, tribe, kingdom, and state, and to generalize about animism, another decrepit category, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, and Islam, all of these teachings are content-laden. But think with me for a minute about this style of teaching. It's based on several assumptions. First, the assumption that the world does not change very fast, and so teaching content from the past will serve well in the future. Second, the assumption that the teacher has had enough experience in research and practice of mission to prepare the student for every eventuality. Third, the assumption that the student will enter into a mission niche and stay there for the rest of her life. All three of these assumptions are woefully inadequate and misleading for today's world. First, let me point out that the world is changing so fast that even yesterday's lessons might not apply today. There's a lot of buzz right now about globalization, migration, diaspora, transnationalism, and hybridity. And I see books coming out in these titles all the time. Well, this is good because the world that presents itself to today's missionaries is not the world of the Bible, nor is it the world of the immediate post-World War II era. Discerning the times is important, and I have argued elsewhere that missiologists do not yet have the times figured out. Anthropologists are still doing research in these areas, and new work is still coming out. If anthropologists are still trying to figure out what migration, diaspora, and transnationalism dynamics are all about, is it enough for us just to declare that diaspora is a great way to do mission? Sloganeering is not the same as doing research. If we are not caught up with the times, we better hurry up. Because the world is changing again. And if we are barely prepared for an era of critical missiology, we certainly will not be prepared for the world of 2020 and beyond. How is the world still changing? Globalization is slowing down. The world is taking a step back from what seemed like limitless expansion. Instead of infinite inflation, we have entered a period of contraction. While we have been constructing mission models to deal with the effortless transportation of people and things and ideas, we have missed a new dynamic. What's happening? There is and has been for the last 4 or 5 years a resurgence of nationalism, racism, populism, and jingoism in the United States and in the world at large. Today, neither people, nor goods, nor ideas are able to travel as easily or unencumbered of restrictions as they were 5 years ago. While some missiologists are still trying to figure out how to be in mission in a globalizing world, the world has downshifted into an era of slowbalization. Slowbalization is the slowing down and even the reversal of globalization. Witness the reassertion of the importance of national borders, coupled with a re-emerging sense of national identity to the point of chauvinism. It's kind of funny, the words chauvinism and jingoism, back in the 50s and 60s, I remember using those words and hearing them, and I haven't heard them since, until today, the last couple of years. Notice the increased restrictions on migration, the use of tariffs to slow down trade, and the increasing restrictions on the use of the internet, both in China and in Europe. Finally, take note of the destabilization of multinational organizations such as NAFTA, the Paris Accords, and even NATO and the European Union. The latter now faced with the first of what may be many Brexits. Who's doing this? Well, the United States under President Trump, England under Prime Ministers May and Johnson, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Romania, the Czech Republic, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, and Russia have all elected more conservative and nativistic or nationalistic leaders in the last couple of years. China under Xi is cracking down on minorities on the one hand and establishing a strictly Chinese set of trade routes called the Belt and Road Initiative that will create new partnerships while excluding others from trade. There is the mission field. The countries that are moving toward nativism, populism, and the inevitable jingoism. In this third stage of reflexive missiology, we should be as concerned about our own mission-sending agencies, our own sending churches, and our own sending countries as we are about the receiving ones. We can ask questions about how is globalization affecting our missionaries in countries requiring creative access. Are things better for Christians in those countries or worse? Will the diaspora that we count on be as ready a mission force as we were promised even a couple of years ago? Has the rise of populism and nativism affected the American church and its mission sending efforts? The world is always changing. So teaching content is a problem because the world is changing faster than we can keep up with. Second, teaching content always puts the teacher behind the curve. I did my doctoral research in the Marshall Islands, 1969 and 1970. Another couple of months of research in 80. Then I was a missionary anthropologist in Papua New Guinea from 97 to 2002. Finally, I visited Papua New Guinea once more in 2014 for a couple of weeks. Am I up to date on Pacific Islands cultures? You're right. It's my answer too. I'm not. Can I prepare missionaries with all the content that they would need to go to the Pacific Islands?
No.
I cannot. There must be another way. Third, the missionaries we send out with one job description will almost certainly change jobs even in the first 5 years. Recent research shows that in general, quote, graduates used to have 1.5 jobs in the first 5 years after graduation. Now they almost double that number. Prospective missionaries trained in content must constantly be retrained or fall out of service. There must be another way. There is another way. If I cannot prepare my students for every eventuality in culture where they are going to be in mission, I can reduce the content and train people more in critical analytic skills, both in ethnography and historical analysis. That is, teach them how to do research in order to figure it out for themselves. For example, make sure I don't get lost here. For example, one form of doing ethnography is called Ethno Science. This is just an example of methods. In a now famous research project, my former colleague, James Spradley, began to study people in Seattle who had been repeatedly jailed for public drunkenness. The officials who deal with them, the police, the judges, the pastors, all have names for them: drunks, alcoholics, public nuisances. But Spradley quickly dismissed this outsider's viewpoint and began to talk with these people in person. He found out that they had a subculture of their own, and they had the world figured out, categorized and somewhat predictable like any culture. Among other things, Spradley was able to elicit taxonomies of types of bulls, types of flops, ways to boost a jug, and how to make a bucket. There are others. This requires the ethnographic practice of giving multiple interviews with the same people and also hanging around and listening to conversations. This is where many of our students make a mistake. They sit at a desk and make up a questionnaire or an interview schedule. Then they go out and ask one set of questions, usually in language that is foreign to the people who are taking the test. Think about every time that you've ever filled out a questionnaire and wondered what the person meant by that question. Then they try to analyze these data. There's no depth in such an approach. Spradley asks the first set of questions to get people talking. He then takes the responses, not with the assumption that he already knows what they're talking about, but rather takes the responses and extracts the words and phrases from the first responses to make up his second set of questions. Further ethnographic techniques, particularly card sorting, leads to an insider's understanding of the domain of tramp. In the tramp domain, Spradley discovered, among other things, the meaning of Bindlestiff, Airedale, and Ding. That's only 3 of about 10 different kinds of tramps that they recognized. In another domain, it turns out that making a flop involves finding a place to get a meal and perhaps spending the night, but there are different kinds of flops. Amongst mission flops, sometimes you can get a meal, and sometimes you can get a bed and a meal, but for some of them you have to take an ear banging. And for other mission flops, you have to take a nosedive. Want to know more? Read the book. The point is, we still need good ethnography that reveals an insider's view of their culture, just as we still need good history that reveals insiders' views of events of the past. And not just one insider, but varied views of multiple actors. Such an approach empties us of preconceptions, insofar as that's possible, and forces us to listen. We give up the hubris of thinking that we know and replace it with the humility of serious listening. So what kinds of critical research strategies? Well, I've enumerated them above, and I'll go through them quickly here. First, expand the context. Once you have a handle on the local culture and language, look around and ask who else has a stake in these people and these events. Spradley was aware that neither politicians nor judges nor the police looked at things the same way that the tramps did. To understand tramps, it was necessary to place them in a larger context. Second, interrogate inequality. The larger context includes people with privilege and power over tramps. What kinds of inequality are tolerated by the larger society? Better yet, what kinds of inequality are required by the larger society? To have a viewpoint is one thing, but to be able to force that viewpoint on others because of differential access to power is another. Ask the question. Third, always question knowledge. Who's pretending to have knowledge? Does someone sitting in the Oval Office in Washington really know something about the homeless sleeping in doorways in Los Angeles? For what purpose does one pretend to have knowledge? Fourth, consider both structure and agency. Everyone faces limitations that are part of the structure of society, reinforced by ideology or religion, and guarded by a legal system that includes a criminal justice system. In a sense, life is a constant negotiation between the controls of structure and the desires of individual agents. People are never simply at the mercy of agency, that is, victims, nor in complete command of their choices. That is, people just make bad choices. People negotiate within the limited choices that they have. For example, Spradley noted that there were many ways to beat a drunk charge, and the tramps knew them, and they knew which judges and under what circumstances they might work, and they shared that knowledge. That's culture. Fifth, discover different perspectives among mission teams. A lot of work is starting to be done among mission teams, multicultural mission teams, and needs to be done, and among the people. Long gone are the days when we could confidently say, well, the Koreans do this, and the Kikuyu do that, or even the SVDs do this, as if monolithic cultures existed with determinative power. Teaching methods, or method, means that the missionary will be able to constantly build up the changing context within which she or he is in mission. She or he is equipped to do the work of ethnography and history and theology himself, herself. That changes, she changes as the culture and the culture context changes, and she changes with the people negotiating their way through constantly new worlds. Conclusion. I didn't hear a sigh of relief. There are challenges in the contextualization of the gospel with people who are on the move, people who are settled far from home, people who are able to exhibit multiple identities supported by appropriate languages, all within a single church or denomination. However, the young and agile missionary trained in research will be able to meet these challenges. The additional challenge lies in the larger picture. Why are people in poverty in the first place? Why are people enduring migration? Why do people end up living in diaspora? Mission myopia might say, well, these poor people got themselves in trouble and cannot help themselves, so we must preach and teach because they are the poor and the lost. I wouldn't say that. It's not that simple. Paul Farmer, for example, claims that an understanding of poverty must be linked to efforts to end it. Echoing Gustavo Gutierrez, to speak of the poor thus without opposing the poverty that kills them is a major obstacle to announcing the gospel. James, of course, also agrees. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith and do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, well, go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill, Yet you do not supply their daily needs. What good is that? So faith by itself, without works, is dead. I didn't give you my favorite quote. So you believe in God, do you? Good. So do all the demons in hell, and they shudder. Let me wrap this up by reworking, if I may. I'm not trying to one-up the Savior here. Let me wrap this up by reworking an old story from Luke 10. A Samaritan travels down the road from Jerusalem and encounters a man beaten and robbed. You know the story, and you know what a good missionary should do. But what if the next day the Samaritan finds another man beaten and robbed on the same road? And the next day he finds another man beaten and robbed on the same road. And the next day. Should the good missionary just keep picking up damaged individuals and bringing them to the inn for treatment? Or should he become curious enough to uncover the reasons that beaten people keep showing up on the Jericho Road? Perhaps he should keep treating the symptoms with no questions asked, or perhaps he should go back to the seminary to find answers. I don't think so. If he were trained in research, he might learn that if he helps heal one body, that's an act of mercy. However, if every day that Samaritan comes across another man stripped and beaten and left for dead and then takes action to discover the cause of this recurring disaster, then works with authorities to find the persons responsible and enables their persecution, that's an act of justice. Which one do you think was a neighbor to the men who fell into the hands of robbers?